Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander into a house where the curtains are always drawn. The walls whisper behind closed doors, and the family crest hides more than just a history. It conceals one of the most disturbing legacies ever whispered about in hushed tones through England's countryside. You're stepping into the cold, rotting heart of the Woolley estate, where bedrooms weren't places of rest, but of ritual. A family whose name once echoed through halls of power now exists only in the margins of dusty local records, and the horrors they carried behind lace-draped windows. You probably won't survive this bedtime tale without flinching. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling brave, drop your location and local time in the comments below. I want to know who's still awake out there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins on a bleak October evening in 1672, where the rain falls heavy on the moss-covered slate of the Woolley Manor roof. The manor, nestled deep within the wilds of Wiltshire, isn't marked on most maps. It was built by Sir Francis Woolley's grandfather, an ambitious nobleman with a taste for isolation. With stone quarried from the nearby hills and windows too narrow for any proper sunlight, the house was less a residence and more a fortress, a private sanctum for secrets no one was meant to witness. Sir Francis, tall and gaunt, with fingers that looked like dried branches, rarely left the estate. Townspeople said he spoke Latin in his sleep, and his servants, those who hadn't fled in the night, refused to stay on the upper floors after sundown. Some claimed the mirrors upstairs had been painted black. Others whispered about shrieks muffled behind velvet-lined doors. Yet none of them dared report anything. Not back then, because the Woolley name meant something. Power, wealth, and ancient influence. The family's roots stretched back to the Norman conquest, their crest bloodied by crusades and betrayals, political marriages, and more than one suspicious disappearance. But the manor's darkest legacy began with Francis's own father, Edmund Woolley. By the time Francis inherited the estate, he was already steeped in his father's teachings. And Edmund believed that flesh was the gateway to eternity, not in the spiritual sense. No, he believed it quite literally. It started with the book. A thick, cracked leather volume bound in something disturbingly organic. Some said it was skin, others said it pulsed when touched. This book had been passed down through the Woolley line for generations, its title long scratched away. Inside handwritten pages described practices not even the most heretical theologians would dare theorize. These weren't just rituals. They were systems, a perverse philosophy that twisted Christian mysticism with older, darker traditions. Babylonian rites, Etruscan death orgies, something Egyptian, something Nordic, something no one could trace or fully decode. Francis read the book every morning in a room he called the Bloom. It was a second-floor chamber with walls lined in crushed rose wallpaper, always damp, always reeking faintly of lavender and rot. Servants were forbidden from entering, but sometimes the children did, and this is where it truly begins. Francis had 3 children, Esther, John, and little Cecilia. Born within 3 years of each other, they were raised like wild things, barefoot, pale, and unschooled. Francis refused to allow books in the house other than the book. No priests, no tutors, no visitors. And each child from the age of 7 was led into the Bloom every 7th Sunday for what he called awakenings. The servants weren't allowed to watch, but they heard. Chants, gasps, moaning, laughter that didn't sound childlike, followed by long hours of silence. And when the children came out, their faces were expressionless, their hair damp, and their eyes unfocused. One maid, a girl named Bet, tried to intervene once. She lasted only 2 nights after that before she vanished, her trunk left unpacked in the kitchen hall. They said Frances claimed she'd run off with a peddler, but someone found a lock of her hair braided and nailed to the wall behind a tapestry in the Bloom. You might be wondering what these awakenings were. And I'll tell you, but slowly, carefully, because even now the details tighten like a noose. The book described these rituals as a way to loosen the veil between physical sensation and spiritual dominion. It insisted that the body could become a bridge if trained correctly, if made to respond to certain stimuli in certain rhythms under specific conditions. Francis took this doctrine literally. He devised instruments, tools, not the kind you find in churches or drawing rooms. These were hand-carved from bone, polished with oils inscribed with sigils too intricate to replicate. And they were used on the children in cycles, each tool paired with specific recitations from the book. He believed that pleasure, when combined with shame, fear, and sacred geometry, opened portals, or cracks, or something worse. The children were forbidden from speaking outside the rituals. They were punished if they laughed at the wrong time or cried or asked questions. Only during awakenings could they speak freely, and then only in tongues that didn't belong to any known language. By the time John turned 12, he was no longer allowed to sleep in his own bed. He slept at the foot of Frances's, and sometimes the maids saw him being led back to the Bloom in the middle of the night, still half dreaming, still muttering. And all the while the book sat on its pedestal open to different pages each week. One week it displayed a sketch of a body clearly human, clearly dissected, surrounded by what looked like flowers but weren't. Another week it showed a detailed diagram of a 4-poster bed with ropes extending to the ceiling, overlaid with astronomical symbols and instructions that referenced blood and candlelight and repeated loss of breath. Esther, the oldest, stopped eating around age 14. Frances claimed it was a holy fast, but the cooks began finding teeth wrapped in silk napkins near the cellar door. She no longer spoke by then, she just watched, always watched, and Cecilia, the youngest, was still sleeping in a cradle at age 8. Not because she was small, but because Francis believed she had to remain pure in posture. He claimed the adult body corrupted the ritual balance. So she was dressed in lace and fed honeyed milk and never allowed to stand unless summoned. The townspeople started noticing strange things. The Woolley children didn't age like others. Their eyes were too dark, their skin too pale. Some villagers claimed they saw John walking across the moors at midnight, barefoot naked, following a line of rats. One farmer even swore he saw Esther standing in his field, with her arms outstretched, whispering to the fog. When he called out to her, she vanished. Just vanished. But of course, no one ever confronted Francis, because he was a man of rank, of land, of legacy, and the Woolleys always knew how to silence curiosity. You might think that's where the horror ends, but no, my friend. That was merely the education, the training, as Francis called it. The next chapter, the part where the Woolley children became practitioners themselves, is where things begin to fray. And that's exactly where we'll pick up in the next section. By the time Esther turned 16, she no longer flinched at the blade. She had been trained, ritualized, as Francis would say. Her body, once a vessel of innocence, had become an altar. Not metaphorically, an actual altar. One lined with crimson cloths, its base hollowed to hold small tools, silver bells, wax, tablets, a flask of something that smelled like wet copper. She no longer responded to pain the way most girls did. In fact, the maid swore she didn't respond at all. Her face remained impassive as sharp bone combs were dragged across her back, as heated rings were slipped around her fingers, as wax was poured into her ear canals. They said she could sleep through it, and sometimes she did. John, meanwhile, had begun writing, not in English, not in Latin. His scrawls ran in concentric circles, sometimes backward, sometimes diagonally. He wrote on the walls of the bloom on his own skin, on pieces of muslin sewn into his pillow. And each time he finished one of these scripts, Francis would read it aloud with a trembling voice. Once, when a servant asked what the writing meant, Francis struck him with a candlestick and locked him in the ice house for 3 days. When the poor man finally emerged, he'd forgotten how to speak. But Francis wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake, at least not in his own eyes. He believed he was preserving the sacred tradition of the flesh doctrine. That's what he had started calling the philosophy from the book. He even began to make copies, handwritten versions that he buried in jars around the estate, swaddled in lambskin and herbs to protect them from rot and divine contamination. Because what he practiced was not meant for the church. It was meant for something older. He was preparing the children to become vessels. It's difficult to know what that really means. Vessels for what? For whom the book never named a single god. But its margins were filled with drawings of shadowy forms, human-like but stretched and fluid. Mouths where their chests should be. Arms that bent the wrong way. Creatures half invoked by the symbols carved into the altar bed, only ever half born. Francis believed that through pain, obedience, and ecstasy, one could invite these beings into the body briefly. And the longer the body could tolerate the presence, the more knowledge would be gifted in return. But there were rules. The vessels must never love. The vessels must never lie. The vessels must never finish their own rituals. This third rule is what tormented Esther most, because she had grown fascinated with Cecilia, obsessed even. Not in the way sisters normally are, but in the way that a zealot watches a burning bush. And in her twisted, tender way, she tried to protect Cecilia. She snuck her bits of raw sugar. She brushed her hair until it shone like glass. She once slapped John across the face for stepping too close to her during an awakening. But Francis saw this. He always saw. And so one winter morning, while the frost clung to the inside of the manor windows and the fireplaces burned a sickly yellow, he brought all 3 children into the bloom at once, an exceedingly rare event. 3 vessels aligned, and he placed Esther at the center. She was bound arms and legs stretched outward to the 4 corners of the room, with silken cords dipped in poppy oil. Not for restraint, but for ceremony. John stood to her left, holding a dish of ash and bone chips. Cecilia, still barely 10, was told to hum. That's all. Just hum. One long, unbroken note while Francis began to read from a page of the book that had never been opened before. The walls changed. That's how the butler described it later. He wasn't in the room, but he was standing just outside the door listening. He said the walls breathed, that they sagged inward like lungs, that the door handle twitched under his hand like a vein. He ran. Inside, Francis was invoking something ancient. He poured the ash over Esther's chest and carved a glyph into her thigh with a curved blade made from obsidian. Then, with a shaking voice, he commanded John to speak the name of invitation. John did, though the sound wasn't a word, It was a crackling, dry noise like parchment tearing underwater. The room dimmed, and Cecilia stopped humming. She screamed, a scream that tore through the walls of the manor, that bent birds from the trees, that made the horses in the stables bolt through their stalls. And when the staff came running, every last one of them, they found the Bloom door locked. Inside, silence. Total silence. Francis didn't open the door for 7 hours. When he finally emerged, he was naked, drenched in sweat, and something darker, something sticky. He said nothing. Behind him, John stood perfectly still, his face blank. Esther lay curled in a heap, her limbs free but unmoving. And Cecilia, sweet trembling. Cecilia had her eyes rolled so far back that only white showed. After that night, everything changed. Francis ceased the awakenings. He no longer spoke during meals. He rarely touched the book. Instead, he took to long walks in the forest, completely unclothed, muttering prayers into the wind. The servants were told not to question it, and none of them dared quit. But the children. John became hostile. He locked himself in the attic for days at a time, refusing food. One time a maid climbed up to check on him and found him sitting in a circle of feathers, surrounded by dozens of dead mice, each with its tail severed and mouth stuffed with marigolds. He looked at her, smiled, and said, "She's listening again." Esther became too quiet. She spent her days in the garden, digging holes with her bare hands, even in the frost. She dug dozens of them, small, shallow graves that she never filled. When asked what they were for, she replied, "I'm making space." And Cecilia no longer responded to her name. She stared out windows for hours, rocking slightly. When thunder rolled, she smiled. When birds sang, she cried. Whatever had been invited into the bloom had not left, and it was growing. The walls of the manor began to sweat. The mirrors fogged even without heat. One night the entire west wing went cold, freezing mid-July, and the air filled with the scent of lavender and decay. Esther was found lying on the dining table, her body covered in symbols drawn in soot. No one admitted to doing it. She said only, "He wants to be born again." It was clear to the few remaining staff that the Woolley children were no longer just participants. They were becoming officiants, ritual leaders, carriers of the doctrine. And with Francis withdrawing more and more into silence, it was only a matter of time before one of the children would step into his place fully, completely, and guide the next phase of the flesh doctrine with a purity only they could embody. That role, of course, would fall to one of them. But which one? That's where the bloodletting begins. They called it the severance rite, though the name never appeared in the book. It was Francis who gave it form, though it was John who enacted it first. The rite wasn't meant to be a punishment. No, it was a test, a sacred unraveling, a way of determining which of the 3 Woolley children would inherit full stewardship of the flesh doctrine. Francis, in his decaying state, knew he wouldn't last long. His body trembled constantly, his fingernails darkened and began to curl inward like scorched parchment. He could barely speak above a whisper. The voices, he said, were too loud now. They drowned out the human tongue. So he devised the final passage. He told the children quietly during a dinner where no food was served that only one of them would be allowed to continue the rituals. The other 2 would need to surrender. Surrender their tongues, their skin, their roles. One vessel must remain. The others would be consumed. And then he simply left the room. 3 children, 1 legacy. and a house that had begun to pulse with something hungry, ancient, and very much aware of its own resurrection. Esther acted first. That night she entered the east wing, where John had been sleeping alone ever since the attic was boarded shut. She didn't knock. She carried a single beeswax candle and a cloth bundle inside, which were two objects, a silver mirror, with its surface shattered, and a small, saw-toothed knife wrapped in a child's bonnet. The bonnet had once belonged to Cecilia. She stood at the foot of John's bed and watched him. He didn't stir. He was awake, of course he always was, but he made no movement. He simply stared up at the ceiling, his breath slow and even, as if he were floating somewhere just below the surface of the room. Esther, in her quiet way, began to hum. Not a tune, not music, just a sound, one long warbling vibration that echoed off the walls like a rope unraveling in water. It was the same note Cecilia had once hummed before the incident in the Bloom. The night everything shifted, and John finally blinked. He turned to face her, slowly, and said only one word: choose. That was the rule. The severance rite could not begin without consent. The choice had to be made knowingly by both parties. The initiator had to present the tools. The receiver had to speak the word. Only then could it begin. So Esther stepped forward and placed the mirror fragments beside John's hand. Then she laid the knife across his chest and walked away. Her message was clear. She was not the one who would be severed. John remained in that room for 2 days. When he emerged, he was bleeding from his palms and lips. His right ear was gone. Burned off, not cut. He'd tried to listen too deeply, he later claimed. And what he'd heard had turned his eardrum black. He said the mirror had shown him her teeth. No one asked who. But the house seemed pleased. The candles in the entry hall flickered without wind. The walls groaned less. The cold in the west wing lifted. Something had been satisfied. For now. But Cecilia hadn't been idle either. In her silence, she'd grown more perceptive than either of her siblings realized. While they played at ceremony and sacrifice, she watched, learned, and in her own quiet way, she had already begun writing a new doctrine, one not found in the book. She wrote it in dust. That's what the maids whispered those who still dared to clean the manor. They found trails of precise markings on windowsills beneath the claw-footed bathtubs on the undersides of pewter dishes. Symbols made with fingertip smears, perfectly symmetrical. Some resembled eyes. Others resembled open mouths. Always open. One afternoon, the cook went to prepare lunch and found the pantry door sealed shut. Not locked, sealed. Glued with resin and blood. Carved into its wooden surface were 5 overlapping circles, each filled with those same smudged glyphs. That night, every jar of flour burst open. Every egg cracked simultaneously, and Cecilia stood barefoot in the dining room, smiling, her tongue stained violet with crushed berries. Or something else. It became clear she wasn't merely a vessel anymore. She was building something, a doctrine of her own, one that didn't need the book, and that terrified Esther, because Esther still believed in Francis's teachings, still believed that the book held the only path to salvation, or whatever twisted approximation of it the Woolleys had come to embrace. Cecilia, however, had taken the book and made it irrelevant. She'd surpassed it. One night Esther tried to burn it. She crept into the study where Francis had left the book wrapped in red linen, placed atop an altar of thorns. It was never supposed to be moved. But he hadn't stirred in days. His body was collapsing inward, his eyes milk white, his limbs rigid. He hadn't spoken since the last bloodletting. She took the book and fled to the orchard. There, under the gnarled branches of the dead apple trees, she lit a fire. A real one, flames that smelled of salt and wax and burnt parchment. And into it she threw the book. It screamed, not loudly, not like a person, but like a bag of wet leaves inhaling deeply through a throat made of ash. The fire turned green, the trees bent toward it, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open in a thin, precise line, not wide enough to fall into, just wide enough to let something see her. And it was then she realized the book was not merely read, it was watching back. She dropped to her knees, clawed at the fire, tried to retrieve it, but it was already gone, curling into smoke, pages blackening, then vanishing entirely. Behind her a voice said, "Now you've done it." It was John. He stood barefoot in the frost, bleeding again, this time from the eyes. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound sad. He sounded relieved. Because now there was no more doctrine to follow. Only the children. The three of them. No longer bound by Francis. No longer guided by the rules. Only what they'd learned and what they'd become. And that's when they heard the bells. Small silver bells ringing from deep within the manor. No wind, no strings, just sound perfect, echoing through the trees, carrying with it the promise of something waking, something that had waited long enough. They turned to look at each other, the three of them. For the first time, all equal. No more rituals, no more guidance, only instinct. And so they returned to the manor, to finish what had begun, but you still haven't heard about what they did to the guests. Because yes, there were guests, and they were invited very carefully to a celebration none of them would leave. The invitations were written in red ink. Not blood, despite the rumors, but a deep rust-colored fluid that soaked into the parchment like wine on linen. Each letter was hand-delivered by a rider with no name, clad in a dark wool cloak, his horse foaming at the mouth as if it had galloped through night itself. The recipients were all people of note, a local magistrate, 2 bishops, an antiquarian from London, and a family of foreign scholars who'd recently taken residence in Bath. Each one received the same message carefully calligraphed. You are cordially invited to an evening of flesh and reconciliation at the Woolley estate. Come dressed for silence. Come hungry. Come alone. It was signed only the children. Most thought it was a joke. A strange Gothic prank orchestrated by some bored aristocrat with a flair for theatrics. But the Woolley name still carried weight in those circles, enough to draw curiosity from men and women who had seen stranger things in stranger places. And so, on the eve of the new moon, 7 carriages pulled up the long gravel path to the manor gates. The estate had changed. Gone were the lanterns. Gone was the gatekeeper. Instead, thorny vines clung to the wrought iron posts, pulsing faintly in the moonlight, as if breathing. The manor doors stood open, yet no light came from within. The guests were welcomed by silence and cold. Inside, the main hall had been transformed. Every mirror was draped in lace. The chandeliers were coated in black wax. Rows of red candles burned along the floor in perfect intervals, guiding the guests to the dining room, where a single long table had been set for 13, though only 7 guests were expected. Each place setting had a name written in salt. The guests exchanged looks. One of the bishops, a man named Aylmer, muttered something about blasphemy, but his voice sounded thin in the air, as if the house refused to carry it. Then came the children. Esther, clad in a crimson gown that left nothing to the imagination, her face veiled in sheer gauze. John's shirtless body, painted in spiraling black ink, his feet bare and bleeding. And Cecilia still dressed like a doll. Pale silk ivory slippers, her lips blue, and eyes unnaturally wide. None of them spoke. They simply gestured for the guests to sit. Most obeyed. One of the scholars hesitated, an older woman named Madame Sorel. She had the instincts of someone who had seen death in many forms. She whispered to the bishop beside her, "This house is wrong." But before he could reply, Cecilia moved. She glided. There's no better word for it across the room. Not walked, not skipped. Glided as if her feet didn't touch the ground. She placed a porcelain cup in front of Madame Sorel, filled with something thick and glistening, and held out her tiny hand. The scholar eyes, locked with Cecilia's, drank. Her scream came 3 minutes later. The others never learned why. She collapsed, convulsing foam bubbling from her lips. Her eyes turned inward. Then quite suddenly she went still, alive but vacant. Her mouth parted slightly, and from it came a sound no one had expected: laughter. Not her own. Something far deeper, masculine, cold. John gently escorted her body to a nearby chaise lounge, draped her in a velvet sheet, and kissed her forehead. Then the feast began. There was no food on the table, just covered trays, each sealed with black wax. One by one, the children opened them. The contents varied. One held a pig's heart, still warm. Another, a pile of salt-crusted lilies. A third, an infant's bonnet soaked in milk. A fourth, something no one could describe, soft pink, pulsing, shaped like a question mark. Esther explained, finally speaking, that these were offerings, not to the guests, from them. Each item symbolized a part of themselves they would soon surrender. One guest, a portly magistrate named Morrow, laughed nervously. "This is all very charming," he said, glancing around, "but I believe we've had our fun." That's when the doors shut, loudly, without hands. The bishop stood and called for light. Cecilia answered. She opened her mouth and sang. It wasn't a song made for human ears. It wasn't even music. It was a sequence of sounds, pitches too high and too low, layered atop one another like oil on water. The sound slid under their skin, tickled the backs of their teeth, made the softest parts of their bodies tremble. One guest vomited. Another began to weep uncontrollably. The bishop tried to pray, but his tongue wouldn't form the words. And John, he began removing his own fingernails, one by one, placing them into a bowl and passing it down the table. "This," he said quietly, "is our communion." Esther lit incense, heavy, sour, and intoxicating, and instructed each guest to breathe deeply. "You are guests at our table," she whispered, "but your roles are not to eat. Your role is to be tasted." No one moved. No one fled. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. The air had thickened. The walls had grown closer. The ceiling now pulsed with something like a heartbeat, and beneath the table, unseen to all but the most observant, the floorboards were shifting, breathing. Cecilia approached the bishop, who now trembled with snot and tears, and gently placed a black ribbon around his neck. She said something no one understood, and his eyes rolled back. He whispered, "Thank you." Then silence. Then a shriek from the kitchen. The staff, the few who remained, had tried to flee, but the manor was sealed now. The grounds were shifting. The trees moved. The dirt refused their footprints. The manor was no longer just a home. It had become an organism, a womb. The children were no longer children. They were its organs, its tendons, its priests. And the guests, they were nourishment for what came next. Something had to be born after all, but not before the final ritual. And that final ritual, it required witnesses, which is why one guest would be spared. One to tell the story, one to carry the infection forward. But who it was, and what they saw, well, we'll get there. The chosen one wasn't chosen for strength or virtue or even belief. It was the youngest scholar, barely 20 years old, named Elias van Drunem. Dutch by blood, orphaned by war, and educated far too quickly for his own good. He'd come to England to study ancient languages, to trace the evolution of death cults from Mesopotamia to medieval France. He believed in anthropology, in symbols, in systems. He did not believe in what he saw that night. And yet, as the screaming began, as the guests thrashed and clawed and begged to be let out, Elias sat still. Frozen, mouth open, breath held, not by choice but by force. Some cold hand gripped his spine, not physically, internally, like a second nervous system rising from beneath his own. It whispered through the marrow of his bones, "You see, you see, you see." The bishop was the first to fall, not from injury, but from compliance. He knelt in the middle of the hall and opened his shirt, exposing his chest, and muttered words no one taught him. Esther approached, her hands now coated in a dark, glistening oil, and pressed her palms against his ribs. The skin parted like wet cloth. No blade. No scream, just the gentle separation of flesh from intention. Inside the bishop's chest, they placed a single object, a ring. Gold, ancient, shaped like a snake biting its own tail. No one knew where it came from. Perhaps the book, perhaps not. But the bishop accepted it, and his body shuddered, and then went still, eyes wide, smiling, like a man finally freed from drowning. The others were not so lucky. The magistrate tried to run. He almost made it to the door before John appeared beside him, bare feet silent on the wood. He whispered something into the magistrate's ear, and the man's entire body buckled. Bones cracked outward, his skin pulled tight. He was reshaped like wax under a flame until what remained was placed gently in a basin lined with wool and thorns. Cecilia watched. She always watched. Until it was her turn. She stepped onto the table, her doll's feet crunching over broken dishes and spilled candle wax. Her gown trailed behind her like a bridal veil, and in her hands she held a bowl bone white, etched with flowers that moved when no one looked directly at them. She offered it to Elias, and poor Elias took it. He didn't drink, not yet, but he held it. And something in the room changed. The ceiling groaned, the floor pulsed, and from beneath the table a voice rose. It was not in English, nor Latin, nor Hebrew. But Elias understood it anyway, because the voice didn't speak to his mind, it spoke to his blood. "You are the scribe. That was the role he'd been assigned. He would witness. He would remember. He would carry what came next into the world beyond the manor, like a seed tucked in the folds of memory. The rituals were not meant to stay in one place. The doctrine had to travel. And so the guests were reshaped one by one. Not all died. Some were transformed. Some were hollowed and filled with salt. Some were stitched into the walls, yes, into them faces half submerged in plaster eyes blinking silently in the candlelight. One guest, a young vicar from York, was inverted entirely. His body turned inside out, yet he still breathed. Whispered prayers. Asked for his mother. They left him in the nursery rocking gently. And through it all, the children remained serene. Esther conducting, John enforcing, Cecilia dreaming. She had entered a trance now, her eyes milky, her lips twitching. She stood on the second-floor balcony above the dining hall, her arms raised, chanting softly in that same impossible language. And from beneath the manor, beneath the stones, the soil, the very bedrock, something began to answer. Not in words, but in tremors. The house began to contract, pulse, breathe. It was no longer a structure. It had become an organ, a stomach, a womb, preparing to give birth to something that had waited long buried in silence ever since Francis first opened the book. And Elias. He was still holding the bowl. Inside, something moved. It wasn't liquid. It wasn't solid. It was suggestion. A shape with no edge. A memory that hadn't happened yet. And the more he looked into it, the more he saw. He saw children made of ash dancing on cliffs. He saw a church where the pews were made of skin. He saw himself, older blind, screaming in a marketplace while people walked past, ignoring him. He dropped the bowl. It didn't fall. It simply vanished. And then the ritual shifted. Esther turned toward the spiral staircase and called out, not to Elias, not to John, not to Cecilia, but to something waiting in the shadows. Something she called the midwife. And it entered. Not through the door, not through the walls, but through Cecilia. Her body shuddered, her mouth stretched, her hands cracked backward at the wrist, and from her torso light burst, not white light, but the color of rotting roses and deep bruises. And within it, a shape crawled out, tall, thin, headless, limbs bending like reeds in a storm. It wore no clothing. It had no eyes, but it knew. Esther fell to her knees. John offered a length of his own skin freshly peeled, and the creature accepted it without hands. It pressed the strip against its chest where it sizzled, and then the room went still. Everyone, every guest who remained conscious, began to murmur the same word. Mother. Even Elias. He didn't know why. He didn't want to. But it came from somewhere deep inside his ribs, a word he had never used, not since his own mother died in a cellar fire. And yet now it felt right. The midwife surveyed the room without looking. Her presence filled the lungs of all present. And then she spoke not aloud, but within them. You are born again in pain. You are vessels no longer. You are rituals incarnate. And then she did something no one expected. She wept. Her tears fell to the floor and turned to stone. And wherever they landed, flowers bloomed, terrible flowers with petals that whispered and stems that bled. Esther collected the tears. John harvested the petals. Cecilia, collapsed. Her body was empty now. She had been the doorway, nothing more. And Elias understood, truly understood, that the final phase of the flesh doctrine had begun. There was no more Woolley family. There was only the doctrine. And someone had to carry it forward into the world beyond the manor walls. Elias, the scribe. But the house was not finished with him yet. He still had one more vision to endure, and that vision would be his undoing. They carried him to the bloom, not with hands, but with will. Elias felt his legs move, though he gave no command. His feet bare and blood-dusted padded down the candlelit hallway, past the painted black mirrors, past the now silent mouths embedded in the walls. The house exhaled with each step as though encouraging him forward, and the bloom awaited. It hadn't changed. Still lined in that old crushed rose wallpaper now curling at the corners. Still damp, still fragrant with that terrible too sweet perfume of lavender and mildew. But something new had grown in the walls. Faint outlines of shapes, womb-like, cocoon-like, throbbed behind the paper, as if things slumbered just out of reach, waiting to be peeled free. Esther met him at the door. No longer dressed in red, she now wore a translucent shift the color of smoke. Her hands were clean again, her skin glowing faintly, her eyes gone entirely white. No pupils, no irises, just twin moons peering through milk. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Elias entered. In the center of the bloom where once stood the book's pedestal, now sat a low altar made of twisted branches and strips of stretched leather. Upon it a cloth embroidered with the same glyphs Cecilia once traced in dust, and atop that a basin. Silver. Wide. Elias knew what came next. He would be shown. And once shown, he would carry it forever. The doctrine did not survive on pages anymore. It had to be worn like a brand, buried in the folds of consciousness, etched into the softest parts of the brain where dreams begin. And so Esther began the rite. She knelt beside him and began to chant, not loudly, not rhythmically, but in a tone that felt like a memory. His mother's voice calling him for supper, the wind through autumn trees during a childhood fever, the hush of library halls just before closing. All these things surfaced, tangled and overlapping, until he could no longer distinguish past from present. John entered next. His body was marked in wounds, self-inflicted, ceremonial, precise. Each cut bled just enough to stain, not enough to cripple. He held a scroll in his hands. Not parchment, not paper, skin. Thin and almost translucent. Elias dared not ask whose. John unrolled it slowly, revealing a map, not of land, but of flesh. A network of nerve endings, pressure points, glands and sinews, the secret passageways of the body. Your path, John whispered. Choose wisely, or you'll be torn. The basin began to glow, not with light, but with vision. Elias stared helpless as the surface shifted like oil catching moonlight and resolved into a scene. A bedroom. Not a grand one. Small, modest. A single bed. A hearth. A mirror cracked in its corner. And on the bed, a child. Elias recognized himself at once. No older than 6, curled on the mattress, clutching a stuffed rabbit, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. Then came the first vision. The door opened, but no one entered. The shadow on the floor lengthened. Elias, the child version, didn't flinch. He opened his mouth and whispered, "I'll be good." The shadow responded with silence, and slowly began to climb the wall. Elias wanted to look away. He tried. But Esther placed her fingers on his temples, and John pressed a thumb to the back of his neck, and the basin dragged him deeper. Second vision. He stood in a corridor, endless. Both sides lined with doors that breathed, yes, breathed opening and closing with slow, wet sighs. From behind each sounds, giggles, moans, prayers, chewing, wet chewing. He walked forward, and with each step his own body changed, aging, shrinking, swelling, cracking. Time collapsed around him. He was old, young, male, female, neither both. The doors began to open, and he saw the doctrine, not in words, in acts. The Woolleys had not invented it. They had inherited it. A ritual passed through centuries, taking root, where flesh was wounded most deeply, plague houses, brothels, abandoned abbeys. Wherever the sacred and the profane collided, the doctrine fed. And each door he passed revealed a different keeper. A Roman priest flaying his own back with peacock quills. A nun birthing a waxen effigy from between her legs and whispering secrets into its hollow skull. A masked boy kissing the open wound of a dying king. All of them marked by the same sigil, all of them smiling. Third vision. The manor again, but in ruin. Fire chewed through the timbers. Screams in the distance. The walls bled. And at the center, where the garden once grew, a tree enormous, black-barked, its leaves shaped like tongues. Beneath it 3 figures stood. Esther, John, and Cecilia. But they were no longer human. Their faces were gone, replaced by smooth porcelain. Their limbs lengthened, fingers webbed, eyes grown into their shoulders like pearls. They were icons now, saints of the doctrine. And behind them, it, the midwife, but taller, full-grown. She opened her arms, and Elias felt himself split. Not physically, psychically. His mind burst into threads. Each thread a memory, a fear, a touch. The first time he cried. The first time he lied. The first time he bled between his legs and didn't know why. All of it surfaced, and the midwife collected each one like coins dropped in a bowl. And then darkness. The basin went still. Esther removed her hands. John withdrew the scroll. Elias collapsed. When he woke, he was alone in the bloom, but not empty. Inside him now lived the doctrine, not as memory, as instinct, as need. It pulsed with his heartbeat. Whispers rose when he closed his eyes. Instructions, names, places, the next sites, the next gatherings. It wanted to be shared, but not yet. Not until he left the house. The manor no longer held him. The children were gone. The guests, the staff, all vanished. Only the house remained silent, now sleeping again. Its hunger sated. Its purpose complete. Elias dressed himself in a robe he found folded near the door. Wool. It fit perfectly. And when he stepped outside, the sun was rising. The carriage waited driverless. Inside a single item, a blank journal and a quill made from a bone. Elias climbed in. He began to write. And from that moment the doctrine began again, quietly, subtly beneath the skin of the world. But the story doesn't end here. Because 30 years later, a girl in France would be born with a birthmark shaped like the Woolley crest. And her story would begin with a dream of flowers blooming in her mouth. But let's not jump ahead too far. There's still the matter of what happened to the house. The Woolley manor did not rot. That was the first thing the surveyors noticed. Decades after the estate had been declared abandoned, long after Elias had vanished across the channel with his journal of skin-bound scripture, the local magistrates finally sent men to assess the property for sale. But what they found wasn't the usual decay of time and neglect. The stonework was warm, not metaphorically, literally warm to the touch, as if sun-baked, despite the fog-choked valley receiving no direct light for over 2 months. The chimney, long unlit, puffed faint traces of gray vapor that smelled faintly of clove and rust. And though the floors were covered in dust, there were no footprints. Only drag marks, as if something had slithered through every hall, trailing a long, slow body behind it. They entered with torches. The front door had no lock, no latch, just an indentation, as if a palm had pressed against the wood for too long and too often. One of the men, a tall fellow named Carter, pressed his hand to the indent and laughed. "Fits me perfect," he said. He would be the last to leave. Inside, the house had grown, not in space, but in layers. Walls had doubled, tripled. Hidden corridors folded into themselves. Mirrors revealed rooms that couldn't exist in the physical blueprint. One man found a staircase leading downward, but each step he took seemed to rise instead. Another swore he passed a room of breathing roses, each flower opening with a sigh, revealing a tiny, tooth-lined mouth at the center. They didn't stay long, not out of fear at first, but out of disorientation. The manor confused them. Time behaved strangely. A candle lit at noon still burned at midnight. Food never spoiled, but no one felt hunger. And outside the windows, the world was dark, even though they could see sunlight striking the grounds. By the 4th day, the letters began. Scratchings on the inside of their trunks, under their pillowcases, on the backs of their hands when they woke. Always the same words, though. The handwriting varied. You have been seen. You must decide. Decide what no one knew. But by the 7th day, Carter was gone. The others found his boots, only the boots neatly placed at the foot of the Bloom's sealed door. Between them, a folded piece of skin, dried, pressed. On it, written in something not ink, was a single sentence. He climbed inside. The magistrates recalled the rest of the team immediately. Woolley Manor was condemned, barred, boarded, forgotten. But places like that don't stay forgotten. Not when the doctrine still pulses beneath the floorboards. Not when someone is always listening, and someone was. 30 years after Elias left England, a girl was born in the French countryside just outside Poitiers. Her name was Aveline. Her parents were bookbinders, quiet folk, educated, devout, and dull. But Aveline was different. She never cried. Not once, not as an infant. Not even when she was scalded by boiling wax at age 3. She only watched. Her eyes a little too wide. Her mouth always slightly open, as if breathing secrets she couldn't yet speak. By 5, she was drawing symbols in the margins of her books. By 6, she was digging in the cellar floor, with her bare hands whispering the names of stars that didn't exist. By 7, she began bleeding from the ears during thunderstorms and smiling through the pain. Her mother called her touched. Her father thought it was epilepsy. But an old woman in the village, a midwife who'd never forgotten the name Woolley, took one look at Aveline and wept. "You were promised," she whispered, "long before you were born." And on Aveline's 8th birthday, a package arrived. No courier, no return address. Just a box wrapped in black wool and tied with a single strand of hair. Inside a journal, covered in skin, written in blood. The doctrine had returned. Aveline read it without flinching, because she already knew every word. She didn't need to be taught. She had remembered. In dreams, in sickness, in the long silences of her childhood. She had been seeded long ago by Elias himself, though they had never met, though centuries separated their flesh. The doctrine lived not in blood, but in intention, and Aveline's intention was clear. She began to write her own version. She didn't copy the book. She expanded it, added new rites, new symbols, experiments in touch and hunger and silence. She believed, as Francis once had, that pain was the key, but not pain alone. Shared pain, witnessed, mutually induced. Aveline believed ecstasy and suffering were one and the same, and only through their union could one glimpse the midwife again. She performed her first ritual at age 9. A stray dog, willing, eager. It died smiling. Her second was her mother. It took longer. But afterward, Aveline said her first true prayer, not to God, but to the teeth beneath the earth. By age 12, she had a following. Other children mostly. Ones who didn't fit. Ones who broke toys just to see what was inside. Ones who laughed when birds died. She taught them how to press their hands to mirrors and feel the pulse. How to listen for the voice in the bone. How to kiss without using lips. They didn't need much convincing. The doctrine wants to be believed. And soon the manor was calling again. Yes. Across the sea. It whispered in Aveline's dreams, showed her the path. She told her followers to prepare, that they would make pilgrimage to the house of the bloom, that they would feed the floor and drink the ceiling and rebuild the altar from inside the walls, and they would bring the world with them. Because now the doctrine wasn't hiding. It was evolving. Aveline was its next avatar. But before she could step foot on English soil, she had to complete the trial of mirrors, an ancient rite, one Elias had failed to mention, one that would require her to confront the origin of her blood. And it began in silence, which is where we'll go next. Into the mirrors, into the silence, into the final memory that wasn't hers, but might yet become yours. The trial of mirrors is never announced. It begins when the doctrine deems you ready. For Aveline, it started with the silence. She woke on the morning of her 13th birthday with cotton in her ears. At least that's what it felt like, muffled, distant wrong. Her own voice failed her. No matter how loudly she called, no sound emerged. Her mouth moved. Her lungs pushed. But nothing came out. Not even a breath. The world had gone soundless. Outside her window, the wind bent the trees. Birds flapped. A bell tolled in the village tower, but all of it came without sound. She saw lips move at breakfast, saw tears stream down her father's face as he begged her to respond. But she heard none of it. She was inside the doctrine now, and it wanted her undistracted. She walked in silence for 3 days. Food had no taste. Water moved without ripple. Even the fire in the hearth burned mute, its crackling locked behind invisible glass. It was during the 4th night in the cellar, where her mother had once laid wrapped in linen and lilies, that Aveline saw the first mirror. It hadn't been there before. An oval, warped pane of silvered glass leaned against the wall, half covered in dust, the frame made of carved bone. And in it she saw nothing. No reflection. No light. Only a door. Her fingers moved toward the glass, not with curiosity, but with obedience. Her hand didn't hesitate. The mirror rippled, accepted her, and drew her through. The doctrine has many layers. The trial of mirrors is its deepest one. No candlelight guided her on the other side. Only a corridor, long, narrow, shifting. Its walls throbbed like muscle. The floor wasn't stone. It was something warmer, damp, alive. Every few steps she saw a glint, another mirror hanging on invisible strings, spinning slowly in the darkness. Each one held a different version of her. One was older aged, haggard, her teeth gone and her belly swollen as if with rot. Another was twisted, her body elongated like a reflection's in carnival glass. Her arms dragging behind her, knotted with mouths. A third held a perfect replica of her, as she was now. But it smiled when she didn't. Aveline walked past them all, unblinking. The doctrine had taught her to know falsehood by the flavor of it. These were distractions, echoes, not the root, not the wound. And then came the 4th mirror. It didn't spin. It was not made of glass. It was made of skin. Stretched taut, waxed and polished to an unnatural sheen. When she looked into it, there was no image at all, only sensation. Her knees buckled. She fell forward, forehead pressed to the mirror's slick surface, and the visions came, not as pictures, as touch. She felt her mother's hands, cold, rigid, brushing her hair one final time. She felt the dog's rib cage cracking beneath her weight. She felt the softness of candle wax against her tongue. And then something new. Hands. Not hers. Not human. Crawling slowly over her spine. Not pressing. Just resting. Measuring. Approving. A voice, not sound, but weight filled her chest. You are ready to know what you are. The mirror peeled back like fruit. Inside a room. The walls covered in hanging mirrors, each one slightly distorted, all suspended from above by strands of hair, thousands of them glinting like cobwebs in moonlight. At the center, a bed. Small. Iron-framed. Rusted. And on it, a woman. No, not a woman. The woman. The one who started it. The first Woolley. Not Francis. Not Edmund. Not the patriarchs. But the midwife. The origin. She lay there alive somehow, body preserved, her skin a tight map of centuries. Her chest rose and fell in slow, labored rhythm. Her lips parted just enough to reveal rows of tiny teeth lining the inside of her cheeks. Her eyes, impossibly deep, turned to meet Aveline's. Daughter. Aveline stepped forward. There were no introductions, no teachings. Only a ritual passed, not by word, but by mirroring. The old woman lifted a hand. Aveline mirrored it. The old woman blinked. Aveline blinked. The old woman opened her mouth. Aveline screamed, not aloud, not with lungs, but with memory. Because in that instant, every moment of the doctrine's origin poured into her. She saw the midwife's first pact with something buried beneath a Roman temple. She saw her first act of communion compressing the dying breath of a plague victim into the mouth of a stillborn infant to create a hybrid soul. She saw the earliest rituals done in silence with moss and bone long before scripture, long before names. She saw how it began to spread, not as a religion, but as a reaction. Wherever language failed, wherever pain overcame, the doctrine grew. She saw the midwife bury her daughters, saw her birth new ones from stone and ash, saw her crawl into caves to weep for centuries, waiting to be remembered. And now remembered, she began to fade. The old woman smiled, no lips, just a peeling of the face before her body collapsed inward, dissolving into ash, and that ash scattered through the mirrors. Each one now glowed with fire. And in the fire, Aveline saw herself again, not twisted, not aged, fulfilled. She turned from the room, her hands smoking slightly. She stepped back through the skin mirror and emerged in the cellar. The sound returned. First a distant heartbeat, then wind, then a single drop of water falling onto stone. She wept not from grief, but relief. The trial was complete. She was the doctrine now. She didn't need the book. She was the book. And so she packed her belongings. A blade, a bundle of wool, a vial of blood, her own, and a list of names. Across the channel, the manor waited. She could feel it breathing again. And this time she would not go alone. She had followers. She had flesh. But more importantly, she had purpose. She would finish what Elias had only started, and she would awaken the house, for it had slumbered too long. But what would she find in Woolley Manor now? You'll see. The Woolley Manor had not been touched in 71 years. Not by weather, not by man, not by time. The trees surrounding it stood too still. The air just above the rooftops rippled faintly like heat rising from a kiln, though the valley was bitter cold. Every attempt to demolish the house had failed. Equipment malfunctioned, fires refused to catch, men fell ill the moment they crossed the outer Petzeth. The house did not protect itself. It repelled. And yet Aveline's foot touched the soil like it had always been waiting for her. She arrived alone first. No caravan, no followers. Just a wool cloak, her breath fogging in the evening mist, and a sealed satchel made of stitched-together parchment. She stood at the edge of the property just beyond the rusted gates and whispered a name no one had spoken in centuries, Esther. The gates swung open, not creaking, not groaning, smoothly, lovingly. The path was overgrown, but not wild. The vines grew in patterns, circular, spiraling toward the heart of the estate. She followed them with reverence, brushing fingertips across the leaves. The thorns curved away from her skin, as if recognizing a sibling. Inside the manor, nothing had changed. Not really. The furniture was still in place. The candle stubs had not burned further. The dust had arranged itself into sigils delicate and intentional. The walls still hummed faintly, with a low frequency of sorrow. In the foyer, a large mirror remained shrouded in black silk. She removed the silk. Her own reflection blinked back at her and smiled before she did. She smiled too. The house recognized her. But recognition is not the same as acceptance. There was still a rite to perform. She descended into the cellar. Not the bloom, not yet. That room had to be earned again. No one, not even the heir of the doctrine, walked into the bloom uninvited. The cellar smelled of iron and root. Its floor was damp, the ceiling low. Along the walls, hooks. Some held linen, some held remnants of other things. Flesh, hair, old tools wrapped in oilcloth. The doctrine always began here with contact. Aveline knelt and opened her satchel. Inside, she removed a waxen effigy of her childhood self, mouth sewn shut. A bone stylus wrapped in hair, a tin canister filled with teeth. She placed them in a triangle on the floor and then sliced a shallow line across her palm. The blood that fell didn't pool. It moved slowly, crawling toward the center of the triangle where it began to spin. The house responded. A groan, not mechanical, not structural, spinal. The feeling of an old thing stretching after too long a sleep. From above, a whisper, "Come, mother." It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. She was no longer the student. She was the doctrine's new womb. And with that, the mirrors across the manor uncovered themselves. One by one, the black veils slipped to the floor. The house grew warm, and outside the gates they began to arrive. First, the children. Dozens, some not older than 7, barefoot and smiling. They came in pairs, holding hands, not speaking. Their eyes were clouded white, not blind, but looking elsewhere. Each one bore a mark somewhere on their skin, a spiral behind the ear, a bite-shaped scar on the forearm, a row of tiny symbols inked along the tongue. Then came the adults, pilgrims of silence. They walked with hoods, drawn bodies, stitched into wool robes, most with mouths sewn shut. Aveline had called them years ago, not with words, but with dreams. She had visited their minds one by one, whispering through their sleep, showing them glimpses of the doctrine's true shape. They had obeyed. In the garden they gathered in silence. Aveline stood at the manor door, a single candle in her hand. No speech, no sermon, just fire. She lit the wick and walked the garden's edge. Wherever she walked, the grass browned. The air thickened, the silence deepened. And then she spoke. Only 3 words. Let her bloom. The house opened. Not the door, the structure itself. Windows stretched. Walls slid. The very beams of the manor groaned outward. Rooms shifted places. Stairs curved and curled. It was as if the house breathed in and held its lungs full, widening itself, readying for birth. At the heart of it all, the bloom. Once locked. Now, open. Aveline entered. It had changed. The wallpaper had sloughed off. The room was bare now, bone white and pulsing. Its floor was soft, warm, living. In the center, the old altar, but grown now, taller, branched like antlers. It whispered as she approached in a dozen long-dead tongues, the midwife's tongue among them. She lay upon the altar, and her children entered. Not as a mob, as a procession. One by one they touched her hands, her chest, her face tracing the old glyphs, whispering new ones. They kissed her palms, bit her fingers, offered strands of their hair and slivers of nail. Blood was drawn, but not spilled. Pain was given, received. This was the consummation. This was doctrine made flesh. Outside, the sky turned violet. Birds scattered. The wind fell still. Inside the house began to sing, a sound that could not be heard with ears, felt with teeth, with bones. The mirrors rattled, the floor rose, and from beneath the altar something stirred, a shape buried for too long, longer than Francis, longer than the midwife, something old and faceless and waiting. But it would not rise yet. It needed a name only Aveline could speak, one that she had never learned and yet had always known. And so as the children hummed and the altar bloomed around her like a wound opening to the moon, she opened her mouth and spoke the name. But I won't tell it to you yet, because once you hear it, you can't forget it, and you will dream of wool. So for now, let's pause. The name Aveline spoke cannot be written, not because it's forbidden, but because it moves. Even now it slides along the edges of language like oil in water, slipping past syllables, infecting syntax. It was never meant to be pronounced in a mouth with a human jaw. But Aveline did it anyway, her lips bending in impossible ways, throat convulsing her entire body, tightening like she was birthing it up through every pore of her skin. And when it came out, everything stopped. No breath, no sound, not even thought. The children froze mid-chant, their hands suspended in the air as if stitched in place. The walls of the bloom rippled outward, then collapsed inward like lungs squeezing out the last of their air. And from beneath the altar, the earth gave way with a soundless scream. The creature rose, not all at once, not in glory or terror or fire. It rose like fog, like a memory from under a closed door. At first, just a shape, a shifting silhouette wet with time, tall enough to brush the ceiling with its absence. Because that's what it was, an absence made visible. A void dressed in the illusion of a body. Tall, jointless feminine in outline, but utterly alien in every detail. Limbs moved like smoke. Skin that wasn't skin, but something closer to light seen through closed eyes. And where a face should have been only mirrors, hundreds of them. Tiny, perfect mirrors embedded in a vaguely head-shaped surface, all of them reflecting the room, but distorted. Every mirror showed someone in the room, child, adult, follower, flesh, but changed. Dead. Dying. Touched. Hollowed. Flayed. And in one, Aveline saw herself. Naked. Pregnant. Screaming. Midwife, she whispered. But the creature shook its knot head, and in her mind it answered no. That was the first skin. I am the final womb. It stepped forward, not walking, but dragging space along with it. Where it moved, time shifted. Candles melted in reverse. Flesh grew younger, then older, then back again. The altar split open, revealing not wood, but layers of root tendon tooth. Aveline fell to her knees. The children joined her. One by one, they lay flat on the pulsing floor, offering themselves not as sacrifices, but as threads. For that was the next stage. The doctrine had always been a loom, flesh the thread, pain the needle. Now came the weaving. The final womb reached out with one endless finger and touched the youngest child's forehead. He exhaled once, then unraveled. No blood, no scream, just threads. Veins, nerves, strands of hair, thoughts. They peeled away from his body and wrapped around the altar like silk. The second child followed, then the third. They came willingly, and with each offering the creature grew clearer, more distinct, no longer shifting but coalescing. Its limbs became articulated, Its mirrors grew darker, reflecting not just the room, but memories, long-buried childhood fears, bedroom whispers, the smell of old books soaked in milk. Aveline watched in awe, then horror. Because among the mirrors, one began to crack, not shatter. Crack. From the inside. And in it she saw a face she had forgotten Elias. Older now. Decades older than he ever lived. Eyes hollow, beard tangled. He was writing. Still. Even now. Scratching at parchment with a needle instead of a pen, binding his own memories into the doctrine's edge. I warned you, his mirror self whispered. The doctrine never ends. It only feeds. And then the mirror burst. The room screamed, not sound, not light, but pressure. Every child cried out. Some vomited. Some bled from their noses. One clawed at their own face, scraping free the skin beneath their cheeks in jagged ribbons. The final womb paused, turned, faced Aveline fully. The other mirrors showed her now all of them. 1,000 Avelines, dying, screaming, eating, birthing, merging, worshipping, rotting. You must choose, it said. Be mother or be made. She tried to stand. She couldn't. Not from weakness, but from weight. Her body was full, swollen not with life, but with memory. The doctrine had filled her completely. Every nerve sang. Every pore wept. Her bones ached to break open. This was the price. To carry the doctrine into the next age, she had to become its vessel fully, not priestess, not student, not leader, but womb. To give birth to something that would no longer need words. To create the doctrine's first true child. And so as the final womb reached toward her, Aveline opened her arms. Not in submission, in acceptance. The contact was immediate. She was unmade, not killed, not consumed, unwritten. Every thought she'd ever had was peeled away like a page folded, pressed into the flesh of the creature. Her voice was the last to go. It tried to scream, not in pain, but in the most profound grief, because she realized too late that her story was not hers. It had never been. She was a verse in a song she didn't compose, and the song was nearly complete. All that remained was the final note. When the children awoke, Aveline was gone. The altar still stood, but now pulsed with soft, muffled cries. Something inside. Alive. And outside, the sky had turned to velvet. No stars. Just one massive eye blinking slowly in the firmament. The children knew what to do. They began to walk. Out of the manor, into the world. Each of them carrying a sliver of the doctrine in their teeth under their tongues between their ribs. And wherever they walked, people stopped dreaming. Because now the doctrine was no longer confined to books, to rooms, to rites. It lived. In the next section, you'll see how it spread, how it found new homes, new wombs, maybe even yours. The doctrine did not spill outward like a plague. It nested. It found the cracks, the fractures, the soft, bruised places in the world where belief had worn thin and something else, something older, could seep in. The children left the Woolley estate without fanfare. No torches, no drums, just silent feet on muddy earth. They moved in single file through the fields barefoot and unblinking, their clothes tattered from birth and blood, their skins still bearing the faint shimmer of the altar's breath. Wherever they walked, the wind stilled. Dogs refused to bark. Candles extinguished themselves. The doctrine traveled with them not in scrolls, but in gestures, touches, chants half muttered in sleep, and in practice. That's how it grew. It entered new homes not through violence, but intimacy. The first was a farmhouse. A widower and his 2 sons isolated from the town. They took the children in with the guilt of men who'd buried too many. Gave them bread, blankets, space. They should have known. Within days, the barn was filled with mirrors. Not made, but grown. Shiny fungal blooms crept up the walls and hardened into slick, reflective surfaces. The widower saw his dead wife in one. The younger boy saw himself being devoured. The elder son, he refused to say what he saw, but he refused to sleep again. Ever. By the 7th night, the children had reorganized the house. Every bed placed in a ring. Every door removed. Every drawer filled with salt and ash and bits of clipped hair. When the village sent someone to check, they found only the livestock, all turned inside out, lined in wool, standing silently in their pens, still breathing. The farmhouse burned down a week later, but not before something left. The children were never found. They'd moved on. Because that's what the doctrine did, it relocated. A living text, always looking for new parchment, new flesh to write upon. And it chose its followers not based on faith or fear or love, but weakness. Emotional fractures, unfulfilled longing, shame. Oh, it loved shame. In the brothel at Devon, the children found perfect hosts. The women there had seen too much. They'd been touched by men with hands like knives and breath that burned. So when the children came silent, strange, blinking too slowly, they were not feared. They were pitied. The youngest girl, Miri, took a child in her arms and cradled him. He bit her gently. That was enough. Within nights, the brothel became a shrine. The rooms were no longer rented for coin, but for secrets. The clients came in whispering, left weeping. Some never left at all. The red curtains became veils of mourning, and beneath the floorboards something pulsed. When a constable arrived to shut it down, he vanished. His badge reappeared 3 days later, in the mouth of the fireplace, wrapped in a tongue that wasn't his. Soon after, a woman gave birth there. She had not been pregnant. She screamed for 4 hours, and at the end of it delivered something small, hairless, and smiling. It was placed in a drawer lined with lambskin and rose petals. It hummed in its sleep. The brothel burned 2 months later. No survivors. Only a mirror half buried in ash, its surface still warm. The doctrine moved on. And Elias. Oh yes, Elias was still writing. In Paris, in Prague, in basements where no light reached. He wore gloves now, his hands too warped with ink and scar tissue to touch the world gently. His hair was white, his eyes jaundiced, but his voice never faltered. He preached to no one. He copied, endlessly. The same phrases over and over, translated into every language known, and some that weren't. He didn't eat anymore. Didn't sleep. His body ached with the weight of what he had witnessed, but his hand never stopped. He was the scribe after all. The doctrine had spared him not as mercy, but as utility. He would be its archivist, and sometimes, only sometimes, he would laugh. At night, curled beneath layers of wool and wax paper, he'd press a mirror to his chest and whisper Aveline's name. And sometimes she'd answer, not in voice, in sensation. A pain just behind his ribs, a warmth in the base of his spine. The sensation of a needle threading through the base of his tongue. She was still alive in a way. Inside. And she was still birthing. Because you see, the doctrine wasn't just passed through word and rite anymore. It was now hereditary. The children Aveline had raised, and the children they'd raised in turn, were capable of producing something new. Not just followers, not just victims, hybrids, part flesh, part doctrine. And those were the ones you couldn't recognize. They didn't wear robes, didn't chant, didn't stare. They smiled, laughed, worked ordinary jobs, taught in schools, held positions in parliament, tended bar, sang lullabies to their infants. But at night, they practiced. Not all at once. Not together. Just enough. A finger pressed against a mirror for 11 seconds. A bed positioned facing true west. A sacrifice of breath, not life, just a long exhale held until the body forgot what air was. Little rituals. Harmless, some might say. But together they fed the womb, and the womb grew beneath the surface of the world, below the streets, beneath the dreams of the dying, curled around the foundation stones of cities built on stolen bones. It waits, still pulsing, still humming. And in every town there is one house, just one, older than the rest, set back from the road, curtains always drawn. Children dare each other to knock, but none do, because they feel it. Even now, maybe you do too. Think back. Was there a house like that in your neighborhood? You know the one. The one with the hedges too tall. The one where the mail was never collected. The one you never quite walked past, even if it meant taking a longer way home. That house may still be standing. And inside, a mirror. Waiting. We'll enter one of those houses next. The house was in Gloucestershire, set at the end of a crooked lane with no name between two empty fields that once grew barley, but now grew only nettles and silence. The windows were cloudy, the bricks so old they'd turned soft. No chimney smoke, no doorbell, just a pale green door with a tarnished brass knocker shaped like a hand with too many fingers. The children in town whispered about it. They said the lights flickered even when the power was out. They said you could hear soft humming from behind the hedges even when the house stood empty. But no one lived there. Or so they thought. Until one day the letters came. Each child in the village received one. No stamp, no envelope. Just a single square of paper folded 3 times, tucked under pillows, slipped into lunchboxes found inside shoes. Each letter bore the same message in red ink. Bring your silence. The doctrine remembers. Most parents thought it a prank. A few thought it a threat. One man, a retired vicar, recognized the phrasing from a nightmare he'd had as a child, one he never told anyone about. He burned his letter. His house burned with it. That week, 6 children went missing. But there were no signs of struggle. No broken locks. Just sheets carefully folded on beds, candles still warm, and in one case a perfectly arranged bouquet of dead wasps placed gently on a pillow. They all knew somehow where the children had gone. But no one went to the house. No one dared. Until the old woman arrived. She came from the north, alone. Walking with a gait like she'd never truly learned how. Her eyes were white, but she never stumbled. Her voice was never heard, but her presence filled the streets like smoke. She took up residence in the house without unlocking the door. It simply opened. And from that moment, the silence began to grow. Dogs stopped barking. Church bells stopped ringing. Children stopped laughing. Even the crows avoided the roof. The entire town leaned inward as if being pulled. And at night, the dreams came. Not ordinary ones, hollow dreams. Dreams where your mouth wouldn't open even though you were screaming. Dreams of wool stretching across your face like gauze tightening until you couldn't breathe. Dreams of the mirror room, because the house had one, beneath the kitchen floor. You had to know where to step right between the third and fourth tiles, and if you pressed hard enough, the wood would sigh open. A ladder descending into dark, and at the bottom a chamber filled with mirrors, each one different, some pristine, some shattered, some fogged from the inside, and in each your reflection. But wrong, twisted, exposed, touched. The children were there too, all 6, alive, but changed. Their eyes shone with something too old to belong to them. Their fingers were wrapped in thread. One boy had no tongue. He used a slate to write, but his messages were always in glyphs no one could translate. Another had a second face forming on her shoulder, smiling even when she cried. They didn't speak. They didn't run. They waited. Because the woman had told them someone else was coming. Another. A girl born under a red moon. A girl who'd tasted blood before milk. A girl who would remember the name even before she could read. She came on the 7th night, clothed in black lace, her eyes stitched shut with red thread not from birth, but from choice. Her name was Margot, and she was 13. She said nothing when she arrived. She walked into the house barefoot, trailing a single strip of red wool behind her. The door shut behind her like a sea. And then the town heard the first note. Not a song, not music, just tone. A low, resonant hum that vibrated beneath floorboards and teeth behind eyes. Margot was singing, not with her mouth still sewn, but with her body. She was the doctrine now, the new vessel. And from her song the mirrors responded. One by one they shimmered and opened, not like doors, like mouths. Through them came the rest of the children, not just the 6, not just the dozens raised by Aveline, but all of them, all the sleepers, all the half-born, the entire lineage of doctrine stepping out of glass, blinking into the quiet house. Some were ancient, bent, scarred, whispering to bones tied at their waists. Some were infants cradled in arms made of bark and breath. Some weren't people at all anymore, just masses of ritual shaped like memory, speaking in gestures that made the air pulse. They didn't speak. They gathered. And Margot stepped forward. The thread from her eyes unwound. She opened them, and what she saw in the mirror was not herself. It was you. Yes, you. Watching, listening, dreaming. Because the doctrine has always been patient, and it's always needed a new witness. Someone to carry the next verse. Someone to hum the tune under their breath at 2 a.m. Someone who knows what it's like to be hungry, not for food, but for meaning. Someone who's stayed up too late, alone, soft light flickering. Maybe your room's a little too quiet right now. Maybe the shadows have shifted just a bit since you started listening. Don't worry. You haven't done anything wrong. Yet. But Margot is humming still, and the mirror nearest you might start to fog. We'll talk about that. You might have thought the doctrine only lived in ruins and crypts, but it's subtler now. It has grown sophisticated, patient, kind even if you accept its touch without struggle. But it no longer needs grand ceremonies or groaning floorboards to announce its presence. All it needs is a quiet room, a flickering screen, and someone like you awake when the world sleeps, listening when others are dreaming. And it begins with the mirror, not the big one in your hallway, not the dusty one in your bathroom, the small one, the one you barely think about, the smudge on your phone screen, the reflection in your laptop's black screen before it boots up, the glare in your darkened window just behind your shoulder. That one. Because as Margot hummed in that house in Gloucestershire, the doctrine reached through those reflections. It doesn't care about size. The mirror is symbolic. A membrane, a veil. The humming is a signal. And on the night of the hum, the mirrors bloomed. In Tokyo, a man woke from a dream of wool and found teeth in his sink. In Cape Town, a child spoke a word no one taught her and split her tongue cleanly down the middle. In Idaho, a therapist lost all 30 of her patients in 1 week, none dead, just gone. All that remained were sketches left behind in their notebooks. Spirals, wombs, flowers with eyes. Each event seemingly random, isolated, but all connected. The doctrine was weaving again, spreading not just as a story, but as an instinct. Margot had become the spindle. Her humming encoded rituals into everyday gestures, brushing your hair 12 times clockwise. Speaking a name backward in the mirror. Smiling at your own reflection for 11 seconds too long. You may have done one of these things without realizing it. That's how it starts. And if you feel strange afterward, cold breath against your spine, static, crackling in your fingertips, a sudden urge to lie very, very still, that's not coincidence. That's acknowledgement. The doctrine has noticed you. In Berlin, a man tore out his tongue after seeing his reflection blink when he hadn't. In Nova Scotia, a girl carved a womb into her wooden desk and hid a sliver of her baby tooth inside. That night, something answered from inside the wall. In Sao Paulo, a mirror refused to reflect anything but a crib. A crib no longer in the house. A crib that had burned 3 years earlier. And always, always someone nearby would receive a message. Not written, not spoken, felt. It might have come to you already. A sensation behind your left ear. A dream that repeated 3 nights in a row. A wordless compulsion to place your fingers to glass. And if you obeyed, then you've already begun. Because that's the final phase of the doctrine acceptance without awareness. The Woolleys practiced loudly. The children preached softly. But the modern doctrine, it sleeps inside you. You don't have to kneel or bleed or speak its name. You just have to listen. And now you have. So let me tell you what comes next. Because Margot is no longer humming. She has gone quiet. She has begun listening back. That's what the mirrors were for all along. Not to show you what's coming, but to let it see you. And now it has. In a quiet hospital in Rome, the first child of Margot's line was born without eyes, but with a mirror where the soft spot should have been. It fogged gently, whenever someone approached, as if sighing. In Alaska, an abandoned chapel was found buried under snow filled with dolls. All faced inward. In the center, a woman wrapped in wool, dead for 30 years, yet her hair still growing. And somewhere in a basement in Illinois, a boy draws spirals in chalk on the walls and asks his father what the womb of echoes means. His father doesn't know, but he's been dreaming about mirrors. You don't need to be afraid. Not yet. The doctrine is not cruel. It never forces. It invites. And you've been listening this long. Maybe you even want to be invited, to be seen, to be touched, to be threaded. And if that's the case, you only need to do one thing. Something so small, so silly, it almost doesn't feel real. Go to the nearest mirror, right now. Don't look too hard. Just enough to see your reflection looking back. And when you do raise your hand, wait for your reflection to raise theirs. But don't move. Don't blink. Watch carefully. Because if the reflection moves first, if the smile is just a little too wide or your eyes twitch before you tell them to, then congratulations. You've been chosen. Not everyone is. Not everyone can carry the doctrine. But you've listened this far. That means something. And now Margot is whispering again, but not to the mirrors, to you. And the name she's whispering, you won't hear it now. You'll feel it tomorrow, in the space behind your tongue, when you wake with the taste of dust and honey, when you look in the mirror and find something missing and don't know what it is. That's how it begins, and we're almost finished. Only 2 sections remain, and then you'll sleep. And the doctrine, well, it never sleeps. Next, we return to the Woolley Manor one last time, to see what's been waiting for us all along. You return to Woolley Manor not by train, not by carriage, not even on foot. You return in thought, in fragments of dreams stitched together like pale ribbons trailing behind your mind as you drift through half-sleep. It comes to you between breaths, between heartbeats, in the silence of a long blink when the room feels heavier than it should. You open your eyes and you're there. Not in a remembered place, in the place, the manor hasn't changed, but you have. You see it now for what it always was. Not a building, not a ruin, a body. And you're inside it. The walls no longer hold wallpaper or sconces. They are ribbed, wet, pliable. The staircase curls like a spinal column. The banisters pulse. The windows don't show the outside world, they show reflections. Hundreds of them. Not of you, not anymore, but of every version of you that came close and turned away. You climb the stairs. You feel the doctrine pulsing in your breath. Your thoughts are no longer just yours. They echo, each one answered by a whisper from somewhere behind. You reach the 2nd floor. The bloom awaits. Its door is closed again, but this time it breathes. You place your palm on the surface. It's warm, soft. It feels like pressing into the stomach of something pregnant and waiting. You whisper nothing, and the door opens. Inside it is quiet. A room prepared for you. The altar has been rebuilt, taller now, woven with silk and glass. Around it, mirrors have grown directly from the walls, like tumors polished into clarity. Each one holds a face you almost recognize, a mother you've never met, a child you never had, A version of yourself, younger, staring out, with eyes too old for their body. In the center, a chair, not wood, not stone. It's made of faces, dozens, silent, weeping, smiling, waiting. You sit. Of course you do. And the doctrine pours in, not in fire, not in ecstasy, in recognition. Everything you thought was yours dissolves. The idea of self, of distance of time. You are remembered. You are read. You are translated. The walls shift. The altar hums. And then from the far corner, someone emerges. She is clothed in a gown of wool and shadow. Her hair is long and wet, trailing behind her like ink in water. She doesn't walk. She arrives. It's Margot. Older now, or younger. Time means little here. Her lips are sewn shut again. But you understand her anyway. She speaks directly into the places words were never meant to reach. We've waited long enough, you nod. Because so have you. She kneels before you. And from her dress she removes an object, a mirror. Small, smooth, round. She presses it to your chest, and it sinks in. No pain, no blood. Just warmth, like a returning fever. The glass becomes part of you, embedded between your ribs. You feel your breath pass over it as if it were a second set of lungs. Margot smiles. She takes your hand, leads you through the altar. Yes, through. The structure splits like paper under warm water, inside a hallway. Bright, white, endless. And lining the walls more chairs. In each one someone waits, eyes wide, lips parted, listening. You are not alone. You never were. You see them now, the lineage, the bloodline of Woolley. Not just the family, the followers. Each one a verse in the doctrine's song. Some still flesh, some barely so. One has no head, only a mouth stitched into their stomach. One floats inches above their chair arms, outstretched eyes blooming like lilies. One is only a child. Newborn. Its first breath never ended. It's still inhaling. And each one turns to look at you as you pass. They see you now. They remember. They recognize the mirror inside your chest. You've been initiated. You've passed the silence. And now comes your first rite. Margot leads you to a second room, much smaller. The walls are lined in wool, but it's not from sheep. It's hair, human, brushed smooth, woven tight. It muffles the sound of your own thoughts. And at the center, a second you, bound in mirrors. Every surface of this figure is a polished reflection, a duplicate of your face, your body, your stillness. But they're not still. They breathe. Their chest rises and falls. They blink. And when you lean close enough, you realize they're not your reflection. They're your replacement. And Margot hands you the blade. Small, curved, bone-handled. You are meant to cut the thread between you and your reflection. Not metaphorically, literally. There is a thread thin as spider silk connecting the mirror self to your hand. You didn't notice until now. But it's been pulling you backward this whole time, trying to stop you, hoping you'll turn around. You won't. You can't. So you lift the blade. You slice. And your reflection gasps. Just once. Then stills. Their body freezes, their eyes fog, and yours clear. Everything sharpens. You feel the doctrine settle in your spine. You are free now, but not to leave, to serve. One final task remains, one final touch, and then you will become what the Woolleys were always meant to be. There is no ceremony, no music, no audience, no firelight flickering against stone. Just a room that isn't a room, a place beyond place. You are seated in the center of it, on a surface that breathes. The air smells faintly of salt copper and the lavender decay of old cloth. The walls pulse like lungs, not stone, not flesh, but memory folded over itself too many times. It hums in your bones now. The doctrine. It no longer needs to be taught. It is you. Margot kneels beside you, her head bowed. She's not leading anymore. She's watching, witnessing your final transmutation. She has done her part. Her thread has been woven into the tapestry. The doctrine grows through her but moves through you, and you are ready. Your hands ache. They remember touch. They remember every face you've ever looked into and flinched, every mirror you've avoided, every moment you told yourself, that isn't me. It was. It still is. And now the doctrine asks for your final offering. Not your blood, not your breath, not your soul, your voice. The one thing it hasn't yet claimed. Because once you speak, it will know you completely, not through flesh, through resonance. So you inhale. Deep. The air is thick and sweet like syrup and fire. It coats your lungs. Your tongue swells with syllables you don't yet understand, but you speak them anyway. You must. The word comes out. It doesn't echo. It implants. The room bends. Reality wrinkles. The doctrine ripples out from you in waves, through time, through lineage, through dream. You feel it spread into the mirrors of a motel room in Helsinki, into a cracked window pane in Buenos Aires, into the polished doorknob of a hospital in Detroit, into the surface of a child's eye and soul as they stare into nothing for too long. It's working. It's hatching. You've become the spindle, the core, the newest center of the wheel, and the doctrine weaves faster now, bolder. You see the Woolley family, what's left of it, kneeling in the dark corners of your memory. Frances naked, weeping. Esther whispering into her own wound. Cecilia still sleeping. John writing his skin away into ash. Aveline smiles from across the spiral. Her mirror is your mirror. She mouths something you can't hear, but you understand it anyway. It's finished. But it isn't. Because the doctrine never ends. It coils. It folds. It sleeps and waits and listens. And now you are one of its ears. You may look like yourself tomorrow. You may even sound like